Hello, I'm Tom Tynan and I head up the Sustainability Advisory Unit at Davy. On behalf of my colleagues in Dublin and London, thank you for joining us today for what is our launch event. In order to make this session as practical and as informative as possible, over the last few weeks, our team have been actively engaging with what has become one of the most vocal sustainability stakeholders, the institutional shareholder. Leveraging our legacy relationship, we've reached out to global asset managers, their fund managers, their heads of sustainability and stewardship for their direct insights. We've also spoken to the educators, the regulators, other service providers, and the ESG rating agencies. On the corporate side, we've engaged with public companies from FTSE 100 to AIM listed, to large cap European and US listed entities across many sectors to gain their latest thoughts. While the title of today's event is Sustainability 2021, a PLC perspective, we are sure that given the nature and the breadth of the content, it will clearly resonate with all organizations, be it public or private, and other entities. On the panel is my colleague, Dr. Dorothy Maxwell. Dorothy recently joined Davy as our Senior Director of Sustainability. Dorothy brings over 20 years of global sustainable business expertise as a consultant with the likes of Accenture, Willis, and McKinsey, and as an in-house Chief Sustainability Officer, and has worked with both corporates and governments throughout the Europe, US, and Asia. Joining us shortly on the stage is Brian Kennedy. Brian is a global equities ESG fund manager at DGFM. And prior to that, he held a similar role at both Allianz Global Investors and also Capital Group in London. His fund is currently A-rated by Citywire, and Brian is on the advisory committees of both CDP and the GRI. Brian will share practical perspectives on how asset managers like him are evaluating and engaging with companies on all ES and G issues. Last, but by no means least, joining us virtually is Professor Yanis Inanau from London Business School. One thing that has been clear from all our recent conversations is that as companies navigate the sustainability opportunity and redefine their corporate purpose, education is critical. From my own experience, Yanis is one of the most charismatic, engaged, and informed commentators on the sustainability agenda. But he also brings a practical perspective and was recently appointed as ESG board advisor to one of the world's largest asset managers, DWS. There will be opportunities for you, the audience, to engage with the panel later in the session via the Q&A button on the screen and typing in your questions. With that, I'm going to hand over to Brian to start today's panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So I think we'd start by talking about 2020, what a year it's been so far. So as 2020 has unfolded, I think there was a tacit expectation that sustainability might take a backseat as the world dealt with the economic and social issues around COVID. How do we feel that that's played out? Maybe I'll start by asking Dorothy how you feel 2020 has unfolded as a year from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Brian, because, you know, surprisingly, environmental and social issues, despite a global pandemic, are now more in focus than they ever were perhaps before. And I know there was a view that in the investment community with respect to the environmental, the social, and the governance pillars of ESG and investor ask that this might fall off the radar. But, you know, as you know, there's too many legal underpinnings now. We have a very engaged asset management industry, and we'll talk more in this session. There's even more legislation to regulate this coming down the line. So I don't think there was ever an issue that this would fall off the agenda. But the fascinating thing from the perspective of the pandemic is that it has put environmental and particularly social issues really in the spotlight. And, you know, when you think when the pandemic happened initially, and businesses were faced with employees and welfare issues that perhaps they hadn't thought about before at this scale. You know, jobs, how do you protect everybody? How do you do contingency planning? And you had businesses that were agile in responding, doing things like changing their manufacturing processes to make masks and hand sanitizer and ventilators, you know? So all of these issues were really now putting that in the spotlight. But as we went further then, and we started to see the economic fallout of the pandemic, it also showed us that our markets are so fragile and the social inequalities that are really there and became very visible very quickly. So yeah, that really has meant that we are hopefully, as we, you know, rolling out vaccines and coming to the end of this situation, from an investor perspective, they really have a great understanding of this issue. And the other piece I think that's important from the pandemic perspective is, you know, the Build Back Better policies, the funding baked into that now is how do we get a green and a just economy? You know, here in Europe, we have the EU Green Deal, which is all about shifting to a low carbon, circular economy, but also a just economy. And all of those features now with post-COVID have been integrating that kind of thinking. So if there's any sort of silver lining, if there could possibly be in such a tragedy, of this pandemic, that using that opportunity is certainly one of those.
Absolutely, and I think it was very telling in terms of the EU recovery funds and how they were structured towards sustainable investment, and less so in terms of obvious areas like renewables, but also areas like energy efficiency within that. I mean, I think that is very telling that even in the midst of a crisis, there's the presence of mind to focus on sustainable areas, and it shows where sustainability is in terms of the priority agenda for the EU. But Yanis, just to return back to 2020 and some of the issues that have unfolded, what surprised you during 2020?
So I would like to first echo and agree with everything that Dorothy said. 2020 was quite the year, if I may say so. And I know that when people during this festive season say, wish each other Happy New Year 2021, they really, really mean it this time around. So Dorothy, I would like to echo some of the things that you said. I think that 2020 has shaken this false sense of safety and security that we had in the system. The fact that our institutions, our economic policies, even if our ESG policies were on the right track. It only took a virus that was, you know, in the grand scheme of things, and despite the tragic loss of life, it wasn't the deadliest of viruses, but it brought the world economy to its knees. So that shaking of our false sense of safety and security has led us to reconsider, in my view, some of the fundamentals. And one that Dorothy was mentioning as well is this idea of the social contract. Right, our relationships with society. How do we look and perceive inequalities? Because once again, COVID has shown us that it's always the more vulnerable that are going to take the biggest hit. And you can start seeing the parallels, right? If we start talking about climate change, it's the same story. We know it's the world's developing countries or the world's poorest are going to be hit the hardest by climate change. So this has hopefully awakened us to the crises that are coming down the line, and hopefully propelled us to start thinking about them in more diligently. The other thing I would like to note is that I was glad to see the role of experts, the role of data-driven decision-making coming back online, if you like, after vicious attacks in recent years. You know, we have heard before, you know, experts don't matter, or we have had enough of experts. So that, but now we see epidemiologists every evening on our TV. So it's critical to understand the power of big data, of rigorous decision making. And last but not least, the role of government that you both mentioned as well. When the going got rough, when we wanted a bailout, right? We no longer sort of were, you know, proud of the big business and the footprint. We all went back to the government for the solutions. Again, government and institution that has been under vicious attack attacks in recent years, kind of reinstate in its role and say that, I can offer solutions, I can scale up solutions, and I do have a say in terms of making this a level playing field. I think for me, those were perhaps not so surprising, but maybe I should frame them as Dorothy said, like tragic silver linings that hopefully will enable us to deal with future crises much better as companies and as asset managers and as citizens at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much reflected in terms of the growth in the asset management industry. So in the first half of this year alone, we saw 213 sustainable investment funds launched in Europe. And asset flows in Q2 alone were up 20%. That was double the rate of conventional funds. So we've seen something of an arms race, you could say, develop in terms of at the asset management industry. Companies ladling on resources in terms of sustainability. Dorothy, you've had the opportunity to spend the last couple of months meeting and discussing these issues with some of the largest and most progressive asset managers out there. What have been your main learnings from these discussions?
Yes, and I think that's the really interesting positioning of Davy. There's wonderful access to these leaders in terms of the fund management industry on ESG. So, what we've seen, if you take, well, I guess the overall insight from all of them that we've talked to, BlackRock, Invesco, Bailey Gifford, 91, is that ESG is now the new normal, basically. And, if you take BlackRock, very much considered in the leadership position, they see themselves as investor stewards and using an investment stewardship approach and even an investor activist approach. So they are setting out their thought leadership views and being very proactive about what they would like to see. So that's really interesting, and that's in the it's publicly available. It's on their website. You can see that, but also they're using things like proxy voting if they don't like the direction things are going and they want to influence that. So also really interesting to see. So, but across the investment community in general, as part of this becoming the new normal, is building up teams and experts within these institutions. So they are using the rating agencies like MSCI and Sustainalytics that we know that also are increasingly granular in what they're able to show, but they're adding to that and they're having their own proprietary tools and their own teams to really get to the heart of is what's happening, what they want to see, and in line with their thought leadership. Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting step forward. But I think, whatever way you look at it, what the investors are looking for is that a company really understands and is managing those environmental issues that are material to that business, and that they've done it in a really holistic way. And you talk about things like gaming the ratings and all this kind of thing off the table. This is about really doing what you need to do across some of these urgent issues. And the disclosures to prove that and the benchmarks that you have to meet are really now gold standard. So if it's climate change, it's about setting your targets for greenhouse gas emissions in line with science-based targets. And as Yanis mentioned, the role of science and facts is very much coming back into vogue. So that would be a benchmark. If you're looking then to disclose through around carbon, around forests, around water, you're looking at previously known Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and showing a track of continuous improvement in that. And then if you're looking at any type of non-financial reporting, you're looking at GRI, you're looking at Sustainability Accounting Standards Board like SASB, TCFD in terms of climate financial disclosure. And unfortunately, it's an alphabet soup of initiatives and activities, which can be really hard for businesses to navigate. However, these are the sorts of benchmarks now that are required. So there's a lot of work to make sure that's happening. And I don't think there's going to be necessarily a backtracking from that.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more from my own observations in the industry that increasingly that proactive approach is rewarded more so than a reactive approach, which simply looks to the next ratings update or anything like that. With the amount of regulation coming down the track, with the increasing number of bodies and expectations, I think the need for have that holistic approach to risk management around sustainability is just so important. And it's increasingly visible in seeing the difference between the leaders and the laggards, as far as I'm concerned. Yanis, I had a question for you just around your position as a professor looking at sustainability and leading in terms of executive education as well. You're at a unique kind of confluence point between investors, the corporates. What would be are those two sides aligned, do you feel, or what do you think? What would be your observations from your unique position there?
I think they're increasingly aligned. And let me give you a couple of examples. I do agree with what both of you said, that ESG or sustainability is becoming a key dimension of competition in the asset management industry. Everyone is trying to be there. Everyone is making huge investments in AI, big data approaches in order to try to get ahead in terms of this alphabet soup that Dorothy mentioned earlier. So certainly the investments they're happening very quickly in order to allow asset managers precisely to do their key role, right? Which is to really allocate capital across society in its more productive uses. And clearly in this new competitive landscape that we have already entered, its most competitive, its most productive uses could not be other than companies that truly integrate and understand environmental and social challenges and how those affect their business models. Now, the second component I want to mention here is that as a society, we're also developing those mechanisms to hold them accountable to those commitments. Dorothy mentioned BlackRock, but it's all of them that say, we believe in ESG and so on. But then, you look at their voting records and you say, well, there seems to be a disconnect over there. And NGOs like Share Action, for instance, and others are holding them accountable to these very important commitments that they make. Because if they're going to be serious about allocating capital and therefore ensuring, right, for millions of people that put their savings, their pensions, and so on, ensuring that we're going to be delivering to them a world that is at least as good and preferably better instead of worse than what we received it. Now, on the corporate side, of course, it's an equally large turmoil, if you like, because companies are waking, let's say, after 50 years or so, to the fact that, well, we can no longer manage within a narrowly defined, short-sighted economic context, but rather we need to really understand the broader social environmental context in which we operate, and that's not only going to be taken care of by regulation, for instance. So I often talk about this as a major disruption because companies are lacking the skills, the knowledge, the expertise that they need in order to navigate these very uncharted waters. I think that's precisely Brian, the role of education. I think there's a lot to be done, especially as we talk about senior level and board level employees and members, because that's that commitment to sustainability or ESG, in my view, it's a profound change in the identity of the organization. It's a profound transformational change. And I'll finish by saying the need for change on the corporate side actually meets this kind of a redefinition of the asset management industry. And I think there are synergies between the two, because if you're a board member or a CEO or an executive team that's trying to transform the organization, clearly you need internal legitimacy. In other words, to get the trust of the employees, of your customers, and so on. But you also need this very important external legitimacy as derived by the support of the investors in your effort. I think that's how I would regard this chain, if you like, between asset managers, companies, and in fact, social organizations that hold them accountable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some very valid points there, and you could say the shareholder has never been more active as well in their role. When we look at the P&G AGM earlier on this year.
I was going to ask you about that.
I mean, absolutely, like that was momentous. But while that gathered the headlines, I mean, we saw 20 other shareholder resolutions passed at AGMs, and that's up from 13 last year. and 8 in 2018. So this is clearly on the move. So, I mean, I guess it begs the question for me, I mean, how long until we see a chairman or a board member unseated on issues of sustainability? I mean, this at this rate, it's something that could realistically happen. But I'd just like to backtrack a little bit and just talk a little bit about some of the issues, some of the materiality-based themes that you talked about there, Dorothy. What kind of key issues or key themes are you picking out in terms of the sustainability landscape?
Yeah, I think what we're talking about in terms of the ESG integration is very much reflecting some of the urgent environmental and social issues that we're facing, both people and planet. And from an investor perspective, what they're looking for is that businesses are part of the solution on those challenges rather than part of the problem. But if you look from the environmental side, climate change is, of course, the big issue. We have a 10-year window in which to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. It's really interesting. Last weekend, we had the Climate Ambitions Summit, and this was the 5-year check-in since the Paris Agreement. It's hard to believe it's been 5 years. And at that, it was pretty much decided that we used to work to well below 2 degrees was the benchmark. We don't have time for that anymore. 1.5 degrees is the benchmark now to hit. So that's interesting in its own right. Also for that summit, United Nations Environment Programme did an emissions gap report. They do this every year, and it's really how are we distanced to target? And that actually showed that we unfortunately are on track to hit about a 3-degree temperature rise. So really the scale of that challenge is massive. It's absolutely doable, but we really have to double down our efforts. So what we see in that is countries committing to net zero. Everybody is now committing to net zero. There's so many commitments. But you know, from an EU perspective, from an Irish perspective, even China, for example, now saying they will be net zero by 2060. You know, this is basically where the benchmark is. And there's about 120 plus countries that have either set or in the process of setting those kind of targets. So it is doable. And we also see business joining with that, you know, from Kerry Group through to Amazon, net zero targets are being set. And even beyond that, you know, net positive and carbon negative. We see Microsoft, for example, setting that. We see them setting their own internal carbon price. So there's a phenomenal amount of activity across government, across business to actually push the agenda on climate change. And even the asset managers, we had, you know, about 30 of the biggest coming together, setting their own net zero emissions target in the last week. So there's definitely a huge amount of momentum, but yeah, the challenge is huge. And then when you look across other environmental issues, very aligned to climate change is halting biodiversity loss and also halting deforestation. And you know, when you look at the science, we need to reforest the world about 50% to take in carbon dioxide as part of that challenge. So they're massive issues. And then the other big ticket one on the environment side would be the circular economy. So if you're in a sector that's very resource intensive, very wasteful, you know, whether it's packaging or fast moving consumer goods and so forth, this is all about trying to recover and reuse materials and keep their value. And there's a lot of money in this. This is worth about 5 trillion to the world economy and about 2 trillion to the European economy. So great opportunities in this as well, as there are in the shift to low carbon. So yeah, those are the environmental issues. And we talked a little bit at the beginning about the social issues. But, you know, when you look across all of the aspects of social injustices we have in our societies, you know, from human rights, from labor exploitation, very complicated issues for businesses and their supply chains on that issue, through to diversity and inclusion, there's a whole swathe of issues there. So net, there's really big challenges. You know, we're talking about the shareholder as the big driver for business to manage manage these in their businesses. But of course, the regulators have been pushing businesses for many years, so they have that pressure too. Their customers are increasingly demanding this. Their employees are demanding it. And, we have civil society from, the Greta effect and millennials and Gen Z being inspired by Greta Thunberg, and also, Marching and Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, all these issues that also is putting huge pressure on businesses as well. So that's sort of the landscape that we find ourselves in at the moment.
We've covered an enormous amount of ground there in a short period of time, and these are all highly relevant issues within their own rights. When we lay those out, there's a lot of disruptive elements to that. And I know, Yanis, the idea of sustainability as a disruptor is a key or central tenet in some of your research and discussion. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that for the crowd?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me pick up on a couple of threads that Dorothy just discussed. Let me start with the issue of targets. I think it's a step in the right direction that countries, companies, and even regulators are setting their own targets. But I think we should be very cautious and avoid what I would call target setting complacency. A lot of the times these are somewhat easy to do, especially for today's CEOs, if we're talking about a target that's meant to be met by 2050. I think we should keep on the pressure to get not only targets, but specific pathways and plans about precisely how we were going to get to those targets. So a step in the right direction, but unless we have those plans, we cannot really yet evaluate whether the speed and the magnitude of change is sufficient. I would actually argue that, let's take just one issue, climate change. We're hugely far behind. I mean, the latest estimates is that we are already at the 1.2 degrees increase in global temperature. So plans and pathways are, in my view, at least as important, if not more important, than the eventual targets. Now, when it comes to the companies themselves, I think it's important to understand that when we talk about ESG data or materiality or how investors use this data, this is not just a matter of technology. This is not just a matter of accounting. We need to understand that we need these measurements to try to understand underlying practices. And at this point in time, this is a moving target. As I mentioned earlier, exactly because ESG is a disruption, companies are experimenting across the board, not only on climate issues, but across the board, are experimenting with underlying practices. So as we talk about ESG data and materiality and so on, we need to allow for enough flexibility into the system to be able to account for the changing nature of the underlying practices, because at the end of the day, it's not just the measurement, it's those underlying practices that an asset manager will have to evaluate in order to understand if the company is going to be around 20, 30, 50 years down the line and what the overall impact of that company is. So I'm a big fan of materiality, but we need to understand that it essentially reflects a company's ability to manage its stakeholder relationships, and it's so doing building intangible assets that are forward-looking. In other words, that would allow them to have that, not only minimizing the harm, but potentially having that positive impact going forward. Now, within that framework and understanding ESG as a disruption, we have to also be realistic. In my view, the sustainability or the ESG story is still playing out as we speak. What do we know about disruptions? A large number of companies are not able to survive a disruption. That's why the corporate graveyard is packed with one's iconic brands. So what is important to realize here is that companies, as they go through this ESG integration effort, they will either adapt or they're going to be replaced. And we have seen already the Teslas of the world, the Beyond Meat, the Impossible Foods. So there's a lot of there's a lot of turmoil that's going to happen because of that disruption, and we need to be not only as companies, as institutions, as our asset managers, to really understand that this is a story of adapt or perish as we make those decisions, and as we try to figure out if companies have really understood the underlying issues that they're trying to address, so that we can measure them using different concepts of materiality and reporting and so on.
I take your point, but one of the major pushbacks that I would hear from companies that we would discuss sustainability issues with would be around sustainability projects potentially being nice to have as opposed to essential. You know, how do companies balance like the pragmatism versus the idealism? You know, what's the trade-off there? Because it can't just be about investing in sustainable projects. There's a profitability element to all of this as well. How do you look at that trade-off, Yanis?
That's literally the heart of the problem, right? I am not a big fan of all these sustainability frameworks that say, oh, there's an easy way to do this. Find a stakeholder, find a win-win, hold hands, dance kumbaya, and the world is going to be a better place, right? If only it was that easy. And by the way, if you're a manager and there's a win-win and you haven't done it yet, then clearly you're not a good manager to begin with, right? The idea there is that there are trade-offs in terms of how do you allocate your resources, how do you mobilize your resources to address particular ESG challenges. And by the way, this is a trade-off that managers actually know very well. Think about it. Should I invest in R&D or pay higher wages? Should I pay higher wages or have a larger marketing budget? In fact, strategy, it's all about understanding those trade-offs and trying to resolve them. So I think as we look at ESG issues in particular, which as we mentioned earlier, they are typically outside the areas of expertise of companies, I think some of the work that I have done actually focuses on two particular mechanisms. So one, we need to understand the willingness of a company. In other words, is it already in the values, in the culture, in the ethics of the organization? Do people in the organization that we're going to ask to innovate and transform the organization, do they really understand the issues and essentially feel them close to their heart? That's a very sort of almost non-economic cognitive argument to really understand the relationship between the organization and the issue that we're trying to address, because that's critical for any transformational process, right? When you try to transform an organization, it's the heart and the mind. You cannot just show them graph after graph of carbon emissions and expect them to, wake up one morning, go to work and change the organization. It has to be more than that. Now, the second mechanism is the economic aspect. In other words, we need to understand whether we should act on an issue, and if we are going to act, to what extent. And here's it's a whole range of questions. Are we the right company to act on this issue? Do we have the resources and capabilities in order to have a positive impact on the resolution of this issue? So I think once the whole idea that, and I think that's kind of the frontier of how we understand this decision making, is to resolve those trade-offs by doing that dual analysis, if you like, for your own organization, and try to understand where you stand in terms of both the willingness as well as your ability to respond to these issues.
And I think there's some very relevant points there made, Yanis. I mean, I think one of the issues, that I would look for when I'm looking at a company is really trying to ascertain what are your time horizons here. And where the rubber meets the road for me on those is sometimes in terms of remuneration and how is that structured. I mean, I like to see that if a company talks about sustainability targets, how do they impact executive comp?
Yeah.
If you really believe in this, then why not link it to your compensation structure for executives? And another element would be in terms of governance. And we see chief sustainability officer roles in a lot of large companies. But how does that fit within the organizational structure of a company? And this was an area that I actually had a question for Dorothy on. In terms of these roles, the chief sustainability role, officer role that pops up, you've taken this role in quite a number of companies. And what are the primary functions and how do you see that role evolving?
Yeah, I think, just to tie it back to what we've been discussing just now, I think having sustainability as a role in a business helps to prioritize it, but it also helps to clarify what it is. Because in my own experience, when you go in to lead a sustainability program in a business, while the business has hired you and they want you to do sustainability, they often don't quite know what that is. That is the first challenge that you face. So the whole thing of creating awareness, but often you can find as well that the company might not really understand what, getting back to materiality, what the really big challenges are that they need to face into, and working with them to identify that is incredibly important. You see often an obsession with small things like reusable coffee cups, which of course play a role, but they may not be a huge issue for actually where the company has its most impactful things. But one of the things, and again, it's to the point we've been talking about, this is incredibly difficult for a business because your measure of success has been profit. And now for many years, we've been layering in also the environmental and the social, and the investors being very prescriptive now about this. So it's moving a tanker, and having been in these roles, I have a great sympathy for that, because that's very difficult. And many companies, particularly those that are carbon intensive, whether it's food, whether it's fossil fuel based energy, whether it's construction, transport, it's very difficult to move that tanker. And that's a transition. And one of the things I've learned is you've got to bring people along with you. You've got to bring the board along with you, and or you don't get anywhere. So you need to say, okay, we need a clear plan. These are our real challenges. I'm going to help you understand them. And then every year set more and more continuous improvement targets to get you to where you need to go. And you do get buy-in, after the first year, people understand and they go, oh, okay, is that what it is? That's a much bigger issue than I thought it was, but okay, this is how we're gonna get there. I can see my customers want it. I can see there's opportunities, there's revenue streams, all the rest of it. And that is how you can shift the direction of that tanker. But it's challenging for any business.
Absolutely. And Yanis, I mean, I know that you mentioned, one of the issues you mentioned, if we could sum it up in terms of how I would look at it, would be a sort of outcomes-based orientation from companies as opposed to a process-based orientation. It's very good to point at certifications and so forth, but what are the processes that are underneath this that are maybe driving innovation around sustainability and so forth? How would you picture, or how do you think a company should set up in terms of governance structure to maximize these issues, or what can companies do differently to maximize their potential in terms of innovation around sustainability?
Brian, that's a great question, and allow me to build on that and what Dorothy was saying. I think, first of all, well, apart from research, of course, I'm an educator, and I do think that awareness and education is an absolutely critical component. And let's be honest, something that as business schools, perhaps we haven't been doing in 50 years, having this more, exclusive shareholder orientation in our teaching and in the way that we understood management. I think that's fundamentally shifting. I see daily with my students. I see daily with executive education participants. These are pressures, like we discussed earlier, that businesses cannot ignore. And of course, the best of businesses, we're going to start looking at these issues as, of course, growth opportunities. To give you an example, this March, I launched an online course, a 6-week course, aimed at board level or C-level, like Dorothy described, that sometimes they just give you the role and they tell you, oh, now you're the sustainability person. And quite literally, they don't know where to begin. And I thought, oh, well, that's a decent group out there. Perhaps we're going to have one cohort of this course a year. As it turns out, there's so much demand that we're now offering 4 cohorts a year from across the globe, across industries, only highlighting this thirst and this demand to not only acquire that knowledge, but to also acquire, if you like, the legitimacy to lead the change, the legitimacy to create a common language, common objectives across the organization. Because in this domain, sustainability and responsibility might mean different things to different people. In my view, it is the role of the leadership to not only set the tone, but quite literally set the language and align those objectives. Now, that's point number 1. Point number 2, I think, Brian, what we know is that there's and from research, we know that a commitment to sustainability can essentially be associated with a thriving organization through multiple channels. Because we often hear, again, these unsophisticated arguments that say, oh, well, if my customers don't buy it, then, I'm just not going to do it. Well, what these arguments kind of omit, and what we do know now, is that there's other mechanisms. Let me give you some examples. If you're a truly sustainable company, you're much more likely to attract, retain, and engage human capital. So that means, quite literally, you're going to employ better people more engaged people than your competitors. We mentioned finance quite a lot. Just look at the availability of instruments out there, from green loans, from loans associated to a company's ESG ratings, starting with ING and Philips a couple of years ago. So we have evidence about a preferential access to finance, or even lower cost of financing. Yet another mechanism of value creation. A big one, it's innovation. Why? Because necessity is the mother of all innovation. And companies that commit to these higher environmental and social standards, yes, of course they face more trade-offs. But the best of leaders say, well, that's a moonshot opportunity. That's not just a roadblock, that's a target. That's an objective. And they turn the problem on its head, and they inspire their employees to innovate. And if you combine that with the long-term horizon that you mentioned earlier, then you have an innovation process that acts like an open system through stakeholder engagement. And lo and behold, you get more and better innovation. And there's other mechanisms as well. There's the social license to operate. There's the reputation and brand loyalty and so on. Now, that's point number two, multiple mechanisms that we have evidence throughout all of them in terms of academic research. But you're kind of highlighting how complex this problem is. That's not enough. Even if you understand all the mechanisms, and by the way, the mechanisms clearly relate to your material stakeholders, right? That's how you integrate them into the business model. You also need what I often call a house of sustainability. You need those organizational structure pillars. And as you rightly pointed out, both of you, one of them is, of course, corporate governance. And I'll give you some examples, right? We know that the best of companies have sustainability as a formal board responsibility. They have a board level subcommittee that oversees. And yes, they do integrate ESG with financial objectives into executive compensation. You cannot say, well, I'm a sustainable company and incentivize all of you on quarterly sales. It's not going to happen, right? So you have to put your foot where your mouth is. So corporate governance, a very important pillar. Long-term decision-making, absolutely, by its very nature, right? And think about in the context of innovation. I cannot tell you, come up with a radical idea and please do so by tomorrow, right? That reminds me of, oh, let's have diesel engines that are clean, but only when tested. You know what I mean? So you, of course, need the long-term time horizon. You need, third pillar is stakeholder engagement. It cannot happen ad hoc. I cannot deal with employees only when they strike or customers only when they boycott. I need to have a structured process in place, make the time and effort and investments in order to build that relationship. Not just for the sake of the relationship, right? If you're going to incentivize your executives, well, you better make sure that what you're measuring is accurate and reliable. But to do that, you need to engage with the stakeholder. And last but not least is the fourth pillar, which is the transparency and accountability. We know that sustainability leaders put out more information, more reliable information. And on top of that, on the accountability front, they diffuse that sense of responsibility, not only beyond the walls of their own business, but actually throughout the supply chain. For instance, by adopting human rights standards, environmental standards, health and safety standards, labor standards, and so on. So I think that you see how the components link together in the sense that, of course, you need the mechanisms to materialize the value, but those mechanisms themselves need to exist within an organizational structure. And that's where you see the leadership, right? Because these are not easy choices to change the governance of the organization, to change how the organization engages with stakeholders. But who said that, change is easy, or strategy is easy for that matter, right? But at least we know where we need to be if we want to be serious about building a sustainable organization.
Brian, I have a question for you coming off the back of Yanis talked about finance and the financial imperative. You are the manager for the low carbon and ESG funds in Davy. Where the rubber hits the road is the revenue. Where have you seen the growth in these? How have you seen that?
In terms of the asset management industry, I'd say that the growth has been broad. I would say that in terms of ESG integration is more or less accepted as the normal across the asset management industry, but we see an increasing growth in more thematic areas as well. This is your more low carbon type areas, your climate change oriented, and even going as far as more as products covering more social issues with diversity related products and so forth. But I think that the growth is widespread, and as pointed out by some of the statistics illustrated earlier, the asset management industry is going through a type of arms race at the moment. So 213 funds launched in the first half of this year alone tells you all that you need to know. So I think that that would really cover the growth in the asset management industry.
So the performance is there, basically.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we look at how even ESG related indices have performed versus their parent indexes, MSCI ESG leaders comfortably outperformed MSCI World through the first half of this year and right through until the end of September. So, and this has extended through to mutual funds. I think this is maybe the big difference between now and maybe 12 years ago, where ESG funds were perhaps looked at as a bit of a bull market luxury. I think now you have some really substantive, processes, but also performance underlying this. It's not just necessarily a nice to have, but to borrow a phrase used earlier, it is the new normal.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I think we can look at some Q&A now if that suits. Okay, so
Are we seeing questions coming into the chat box?
We have questions coming in here now, and so one that I will ask as an open question: are the recently published WEF indicators likely to become the global standards for ESG measurement? So anyone want to?
Well, I'm happy to jump in there. I think that one of the challenges is, I touched a little bit earlier about some of the initiatives. We do have a myriad of things at the moment. And there is a coalescing around some of them. If you look at the disclosures that are there, you have the ones that are well established, like CDP. So that's fine, and that's clear around carbon, around forests and water. If you look at climate-related disclosures, we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Finance Disclosures. We also have the revision of the non-financial directive here in the EU happening next year. They say it will be Q1 in 2021. So that will be important to get clarity across a lot of non-financial metrics. Mm-hmm. And you have the coalescing between GRI, integrated reporting, and sustainability accounting, here we go, it's the alphabet soup, I'm falling over. Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. So all of these guys coming together saying we will do climate-related disclosure similarly. So I think this is still a movable feast is what I'm going the long way around to basically say. So, but I think it is getting there. And Mark Carney, who has been the chairman at TCFD and also is one of the ambassadors for COP26 coming up in November, the next big climate summit in 2021, he has said that at that, the mechanisms for climate-related disclosure and really becoming clear around that, and particularly the role of TCFD will be visible at that particular point. And the UK have already mandated that by 2025 for large businesses, that will be a key obligation. So we need clarity as to what the rules are of the game. So for that question, I think it's still a little bit watch this space, but 2021 should give that level of refinement.
Yeah, absolutely. And to touch on a point raised earlier, that sometimes it is a bit of an alphabet soup. It is can be dizzying, the number of standards out there. But a holistic approach to risk management would really sort of protect or insulate a company against or help them future-proof against more disclosures. And so, Yanis, did you have something to add in terms of this?
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple of things. So first of all, we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is a very fast-moving space. And the other comparison we have is, how long did it take us to get to financial reporting standards, right? So compared to that, which took almost 100 years, we're moving much more quickly in this space. Clearly, we're in the muddy middle where there's a lot of mess and an alphabet soup, as we said earlier. But I am optimistic in the sense that we do now have some initial consolidation. In other words, look at SASB and the International Integrated Reporting Council merging, for instance. And I do think that we are at a point where all these different voluntary reporting standards have developed the distinct expertise in the domains that they cover. So now I hope and pray that we go on the next stage where we bring together all that learning into one standard. But we have to keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, as companies, right, it is important to do our part in educating. In other words, yes, we can have the reporting standards, but at the end of the day, as businesses, we know best which of those ESG issues are relevant for our ability to create value. So that doesn't mean that the obligation is only on the standard. Companies need to educate their own investors, and in this case, their asset managers, in terms of how do those ESG measures and which measures fit into and accurately describe a company's ability to actually create that value, right? So I think, and the last thing I'm going to say is that we should expect, and we are already seeing regulatory interventions, because perhaps we are now at the point where the market feels a bit too fragmented, right? And then that's a good thing. I mean, all this entry means that these are critically important issues. We do see the technology investments that we mentioned earlier in terms of understanding the data. But on the reporting, on the formal reporting front, we do need, in my view, a regulatory intervention, but flexible one. Remember what we said earlier, companies themselves are experimenting with these issues. We haven't settled on best practices across the whole of the ESG domain. So we need to come up with standards that are sufficiently flexible, yet at that point in time, accurate in terms of capturing those processes.
Yanis, you just provided the perfect segue to the next question that's come through. So neatly done. How do you see the role of government in terms of driving the required change? Maybe Dorothy, I'll put that one to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Yanis, you mentioned this at the beginning. It's fascinating to me. In my time in sustainability, originally government was the main driver, you know, and we've got over 300 pieces of environmental law alone in Europe. So, you know, they really were powerful at the beginning, and that has been diluted over the last 10 years. And now we're coming back into the space where government actually plays a key role. So I think, you know, government, if we look at the European situation, particularly for climate change, the question is around, we have EU emissions trading, we have carbon market and carbon pricing. Internationally, of course, that's needed as well. So I think there's a massive role for government to step up in terms of that.
Absolutely. Yanis, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Government is critical. We're going to need regulation when it comes to reporting, for instance, in order to make sure that we do arrive at those standards. But it's also important to realize that government has other roles as well. For example, government through procurement and all the infrastructure development, for instance, they can have a material impact on ESG by requiring ESG when they go out to tender, for instance, right? Now, what is also important, though, is that we as citizens, and I mean each and every one of us, should not deflect this to the government, because, you know, we are the government. We put those people there. And in the same way that we hold accountable companies and asset managers, we ought to hold accountable governments in terms of their commitments. And should they fail to meet them, and we have seen many governments that failed to meet them in recent years, have the courage at the voting booth to vote them out. Exactly what happened in the latest U.S. elections, right? When really the Biden-Harris win is going to entirely open up a new chapter of climate leadership by the U.S., despite the backward steps that they took in the Trump administration. So let's not think about government as, you know, something foreign. Some government and their policies is us and our behavior in the voting booth, right? And that's really important to keep in mind.
I think that's a very relevant point as well about potential US catch-up with the EU. I mean, we've seen two quite divergent programs, and especially from where I'm sat as a fund manager, we see that the EU has been quite progressive in terms of regulating the asset management industry. We look at SFDR, this being rolled out in 2021, and the intention there really being that we have the same sort of transparency around financial products that we might have with electrical appliances or BER ratings on houses. So it really is an extremely ambitious piece of regulation, to the point that it's actually outstripped the sophistication of the asset management industry, and some of the more advanced aspects of it have been postponed to a later date. But it gives an idea of the kind of landslide of data that is going to be required of corporates. This all flows downhill. We're all in one circuitous loop as far as ESG data is concerned. So, and just one final question then to wrap up. So, how do corporates deal with the different and often conflicting methodologies from the ESG rating agencies?
Well, I can start here. I think that you alluded to this earlier, Brian. If you're a business, and particularly a PLC that has these asks from their investors, working to the best science, working to the best standards, they're all there. It can be complicated now, but they're all there. When I was talking earlier, I was saying the rating agencies are important and they are used, but beyond that now we have investors doing an additional layer of analysis. So what you want to do for the business perspective is to be working to the best practice, but also being really visible about that. If you're working to science-based targets, you have to be clear about that and the other disclosures accordingly. And then when it comes to either how you report and how you give that disclosure, well, there are a myriad of things, and we've mentioned that a few times, and that can be confusing. If you are working to them, you will be giving that gold standard that the investor is looking for. So I think you will overcome some of those differences that for sure are there as these different ratings are continuing to evolve. And I know some of them are doing some upgrades at the moment where we might see some differences into next year. But it's a moving target also, as Jana said. So that, it will be a feature, I think, also of this area.
I mean, I completely agree with the points made. I mean, I think you take a very prescriptive approach of just trying to meet the requirements of the rating agencies. If you do get a methodology change, as we've seen, then you can be left in the cold from that. And I think we'll see that happen to some companies when we see MSCI update their methodology at the moment. So, I mean, it is really asking companies to take, look beyond the ratings towards the risks and how best they manage and then subsequently disclose on those to get ahead of the problem, if you will. So, Yanis, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think I absolutely agree with you, Brian. It's a messy, it's a costly, and it's a frustrating space. That's the truth of it, and we need to acknowledge that, right? I think that in that big mess, companies can, of course, as we mentioned earlier, educate their stakeholders, and in particular their investors, about which metrics they're using, how are those metrics capturing value creation, and in fact, how do they contribute to a company's competitiveness and broader social impact? So there is it's a two-way dialogue here. It's not just a one-way, as you mentioned, managing for those metrics in and of themselves. Second of all, I have seen already there is software out there. In other words, there are tech solutions that allow companies to sort of gather raw data and then accordingly package it, if you like, depending on the requirements. But again, and this is the last point I'm going to make, we should not assume that the other side is often as sophisticated. For instance, I was a couple of years ago speaking with a mining company, and their head of ESG told me, look, I have investors that call me and ask me, what's my work from home policy? Like, we are a mining company, we cannot work from home. So, in other words, an immaterial issue. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And the last thing is that, you know what, I'm pretty sure you do this as well. ESG data, it's only one piece of the puzzle. As you mentioned earlier, engagement with the company, understanding the management, its mind frame, its objectives, its credibility, its authenticity. It's a very, very important component that comes and, puts some flavor, texture, context to this data. So it's not just about how you report the data, it's essentially who you are as a company and how you communicate that more broadly.
Well, I think we're running short on time. So I want to thank everybody for their questions, and I hope we answered them adequately. I think the difficulty with this topic is, as you could see, we could go on and on. So thank you from Tom, from myself, from Brian, and from Yanis. I hope you found this webinar valuable. As a next step from us, we will circulate the recording of the event. We're also producing a white paper on some of the key topics, and we'll circulate that out to all the attendees. And please feel free to get in contact with us if you have any questions and if we can help. So with that, I wish everybody a very happy and also a safe holiday season. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.